It's my pleasure to introduce Emeritus Professor Brian Stoddart, who is a historian by his academic training, but was Vice-Chancellor of La Trobe University in Melbourne, and more recently has been a consultant and advisor on education internationally, including in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And here today, we're going to be talking with Brian about Australia's post-secondary education system, that is both university education and technical and further education, or vocational education as it's sometimes called, and how that fits into the vision for Australia's economic and social future. Welcome, Brian. It's a pleasure to be talking with you today.
And likewise, Saul, wonderful to be here.
Thank you. Perhaps if we could start by understanding what the problems actually are at the moment with Australia's post-secondary education system. Where is it failing to fit the needs that Australia is likely to have over the next decade and beyond?
That's a really great starting point for this. And I think there's probably a two-part response to it. One is what I'd term the immediate challenge that the sector has got, is that it seems to have lost favour with both major sides of politics and also with the public. And there's a whole set of reasons for that, I think, that will come out over the course of this. And only part of that, I think, is also at the feet of what I call some really structural issues around time. I think it's fairly well known that over the last several years, there's been a very strong chase in the university sector for the international ranking systems. And that is, you've got to get higher up the ranking system. No one's ever really worked out why that is the case. And while a lot of my colleagues and former colleagues in the sector would probably disagree with me, one of the major driving forces of that has been to attract international students. And if you look at that over the last 30 to 40 years, that's been a major driver for export income in Australia. I mean, it's fairly well known. There's some bald figures thrown around, and I'm sure you've got some issues with a lot of them. But for the last year, for example, I was talking about it's over $40 billion of income, and that's always put it for the last several years in the top 4 export industries in Australia. And it's been really, it hasn't been very well understood. And that means that there's been a real drive in international students. We've now got universities with something like 40% plus of their enrolment consisting of fee-paying international students. And both sides of politics have become concerned about that, largely, I think, because of the idea that that's put pressure on the housing system, which I think is hugely arguable. But what we've got now is a sector that is funded largely on the back of those. You go into any of the major modern campuses in any metropolitan city, certainly down the East Coast, and you'll see huge buildings and lots of activity going on. It's all driven by that income. Now, the universities traditionally have said that that was, in a sense, forced on them by inadequate funding systems at the federal level. And I think we're now at a point where that sort of debate is really taking off. So we've got a lot of issues around where both sides of politics are wondering where the value for money in this is. There's some ideas about what's caused all of that. There's some public skepticism about it. And now there's a lot of, I think, knee-jerk reaction in some quarters about what we might do. So you will have seen, for example, in the last few days, the opposition leaders come out and said that if they got into power, then a coalition government would see the group of 8 universities, the old sandstone, Sydney, Melbourne, and all the rest, they would end up with massive fees, sort of 5 times what's being paid now. And what's being paid now is seriously competitive internationally because it's an awful lot of money.
It's kind of interesting to reflect the changes over a long period of time in the attitude of the major political parties to tertiary education. I mean, Sir Robert Menzies, the founder of the modern Liberal Party, was a great champion of tertiary education. Part of his legacy was the Commonwealth Tertiary Education Scholarship
Yep.
Scheme and the creation of the new universities, Monash in Melbourne, UNSW in New South Wales, Griffith in Queensland, I think Flinders in South Australia, maybe even Murdoch in Western Australia, are legacies of Menzies' enthusiasm for tertiary education. And of course, that continued through to Whitlam, making tertiary education free, and during his period and afterwards, setting up more tertiary institutions in our capital cities. And then under the Hawke and Keating governments, the merger of colleges of advanced education, as they were, into what have now become, in many cases, regional universities, as well as the absorption of various institutes into the big universities in the capital cities. But since then, we've seen the Gillard government cut back university funding to pay for what was meant to be Gonski 2.0. And then the coalition government seemed to take a particularly vindictive attitude to universities, and in particular to law, economics, and arts degrees. The cynic in me says that that's because the Labor Party assumes that it's got all of the student vote and therefore doesn't need to do anything to chase it. Whereas the coalition seems to think that universities are now institutions that take kids from liberal voting families and turn them into Labor, or even worse, Green voting families, and therefore they're not going to give them any money as well. But I mean, that's just me being cynical about politicians, which I have long been. Is there anything else there that's a bigger part of the story?
Well, I think there's a couple of spin-offs that come from it, Saul, and your cynicism is forgiven, because I think we've seen some massive changes in assumptions about what universities do. And if I could just retrace perhaps a little of that really excellent potted history that you've just put in. What we've seen, of course, over the course of, in a sense, our working lifetime, is universities moving from what we might bluntly call an elitist situation into one that's a much more mass-oriented, sort of North American, heavily college-oriented one. And that's continuing because, as you'll know, at the moment, this present government has set a target of something like 80% of the workforce being university educated by about 2050. So we've had this big move from elite really over to mass, and that's caused some attitudinal changes, I think, certainly within the political sphere, but it's also changed it a lot, I think, in the popular sphere as well. And I mean, you'll know sort of all of the jokes from the UK about, oh, what are you studying? Oh, you're doing media studies like 4 million other people. There's a sense in which we went, and I personally put some of this down. In fact, I'll probably put quite a lot of it down to the Dawkins changes back in 1988, which is what you mentioned about the turning of the TAEs and a few others into universities and expanding the number of universities. I think it's worth making the point over a while that there's been a persistent think piece since then that, do we have too many universities? And you'll see the drive for all of this. And of course, the fact that we need more is tied to this idea that we've got to turn it into a mass operation. And I think that's where we're getting to something of an inflection point now, because the real question that sits in behind that is, as a nation, what do we actually want the university system to do for us, and how does it contribute to economic growth, and how does it actually contribute to social growth, particularly when we're looking in a period when we've got massive demographic shifts and all of the related things that go with that. And I think, like the politicians, the public itself has not really had enough of an engagement with the sector to work out what we really want to do. And tied to that, I think, is a really deep philosophical point that's always been problematic in Australia. You may well be right. Menzies had a view that was a bit different from now. And the key challenge that I see is that these days we are seeing higher education as a cost rather than as an investment. We'll get on to some of the potential reforms of the system, but it's really about switching that mindset, because over the last probably 20 to 30 years, we've had governments that persistently see it as a drain on the economy. And in some reasons, that's because we've got a system called, the helps. There was the old HEC scheme. Now we've got help, and we're sitting with 70 to $80 billion worth of debt on the public account from unpaid student loans. And in a sense, that's propped up the university system on the way through because they've got the money out of the government. The government's paid them as an advance to the students themselves, who will then repay at a later point when they hit a salary inflection point. But all of that's sitting there. And of course, I think that's encouraged the idea that this is a real drain on the public accounts and not an investment for the future.
Good. So just sort of in passing talking about that, there's also a view one hears, which I think has some merit and substance behind it, that in the push to get more people into tertiary education, perhaps we've undervalued technical and further education and the training of skilled tradespeople. Traditionally, that's never had as much support financially from governments as tertiary education has, because the assumption has been that a lot of that training would be paid for by employers, by businesses, and state-owned enterprises in particular, when we had more of them than we had today, used to take on far more apprentices than they would ever need, knowing that they were kind of fulfilling a community function in training people with skills that would ultimately be working in the private sector. What would you say about the way in which the technical and further educational or vocational training system has evolved over the same period that these changes in universities have been occurring?
Oh, I think it's a really strong point, Saul, and I think there's a pretty general agreement that what's happened to the TAFE sector has actually been a disaster, in that it was sort of turned over to private providers for a while, massive drain on public funds there, probably something like $2 billion lost over time, and no real results to show for it. In fact, probably a declining amount of productivity in terms of getting skilled people out. And that's really sitting in the middle of what we're facing now, how best to do that. And there is a move to get a greater harmonisation between those two sectors and a sort of greater interchangeability. And I think there's been a number of us around the sector for years who've argued about this. What we started to see a few years ago was a number of graduates from the university system then going back to TAFE and getting a practical skill to add to their armory, as it were, because they found themselves they were much better employable prospects than sort of coming out of a mass university system. And I think that goes back to the idea about what's the education process for? And over sort of 40 or 50 years' time, it's clear that there's been a lot more accountability required of both of those major sectors. I mean, back in the Menzies days, it was probably too much of an exaggeration to say it was an easy job being a vice chancellor, but someone threw a bucket of load of money at you, came back the following year and threw another bucket load at, and never really asked you what was happening to that money. That's changed dramatically, of course, over the last 30 or 40 years, correctly so, because we're all interested in accountability. But what it's done is that we haven't really paid nearly as much attention to the technical side. And think about, say, somewhere like Germany, that for years had a very strong technological university production line, massive numbers of highly skilled engineers coming out. If you look at somewhere like India now, why are we getting so many Indian tech people through the US, Europe, UK, Asia, Africa, everywhere? Well, it's simply because they invested heavily in the Indian Institutes of Technology, really from the 50s and the 60s onwards. And you're seeing the net result of that hugely competitive system to get into, massively talented people coming out of it. And we haven't gone anywhere near that. And that comes back again, I think, to, as a nation, what do we really want out of this?